So, Bob, I got an email about antisocial personality disorder that got me hot under the collar, and I thought we would read it and respond. What do you say, Bob?
Yeah, let's do it.
Anonymous meal tier patron, they say, hello, Dr. Kirk, Honda, and Bob. I was diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder some years ago.
Wow.
I was diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder some years ago, and upon learning of my diagnosis, I decided to seek out information to better understand it and how it relates to me. Fast forward a few years, and well, just chiming in here, what would you imagine the circumstances were around this individual having an official diagnosis?
Well, I would imagine unless they sought therapy on their own, they were involved in the legal system.
Could be. Could also be actual therapy.
Could be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In fact, I would imagine that to be the case, but I don't know. But yeah, I would say probably the majority of documented diagnosing of an individual of antisocial, it would be in the legal system. But I also imagine that you could be in couple therapy or even, regular individual therapy, because people with antisocial have a lot of different profiles. There's the stereotypical profile, which is a legit profile in which someone with antisocial is in and out of prison, they're violent, they are impulsive, they exploit others, they're hurtful to other people, their life is a bit of a train wreck, they have drug and alcohol problems, that's a profile. But you have other profiles where someone feels like there's something different about them growing up, and they don't want to harm other people, but they don't feel bad if they do. And they know that if they act on their impulse of not caring about other people's feelings and using them as stepping stones, that it'll come back around to hurt them. So they will have to pay attention, more energy in their brain to make sure that they avoid consequences to themselves by hurting other people.
That's a Kohlberg stage. I mean, it's basically morality based on cost benefit.
What do you mean?
Well, what's the cost of the behavior? What's the benefit of the behavior? And so I choose what I choose based on those factors.
Right.
And all people go through a state of more. Where do we stand on Kohlberg these days? Do we think that Kohlberg holds water?
I don't know. It's been a while since I've looked into it, but it's a worthy model of considering.
Yeah. So, children go through a stage of morality where that's how they think. And
what's beyond that stage?
It's been so long.
Let's see what the old internet says. You got the pre-conventional stage. You have stage 1, in which you are obedient and worried about punishment.
Right.
Stage 2 is individualism and exchange, which is the stage you were talking about, right? Mm-hmm. At this stage, individuals recognize that there is not just one right view, but that different individuals have different viewpoints. Morality is based on reciprocity and fairness. Stage 3 is interpersonal relationships. At this stage, individuals seek approval from others and conform to societal norms. At this stage, approval, morality is based on maintaining good relationships and following rules to please others. Mm-hmm. Stage 4 is maintaining social order. At this stage, individuals conform to societal laws and norms to maintain social order and avoid guilt. Morality is based on following the rules and fulfilling duties to society. That's kind of interesting because that stage is front and center on Twitter these days, if you think about it, right? Well, you would know because you don't pay attention to those things, but for people who are on Twitter or on Reddit or whatever, there's this high level of individual scrutiny on oneself about avoiding guilt and maintaining social order and conforming to societal laws as they change over time, for the better often. But it's interesting that that's not the highest level, right, according to this model. Stage 5 is societal contract and individual rights. At this stage, individuals recognize that laws and rules are societal contracts that can be changed for the greater good. Morality is based on upholding individual rights and democratic principles. I see. So at this stage, you are thinking more meta about the societal order and the societal rules and laws. You're not just following them without thinking about them. You're thinking, well, what's the bigger purpose and value and meaning That's interesting. Stage 6 is, at this stage, individuals develop their moral principles based on universal ethical principles. Morality is based on abstract reasoning and commitment to social justice and equality. So that's interesting.
That is interesting.
I'm sure there's a lot more detail there that I'm not picking up on. But anyway, so you were saying that for some folks with antisocial that lack empathy the way that other people will feel, they might have a version of behavioral management for themselves that involves one of these stages. Like, they are trying to avoid problems happening to them. I don't really hear that in any of these stages, by the way. Maybe some of the earlier stages, but yeah. So you could have someone who ends up in therapy because of depression or anxiety or relationship problems, because that's a misnomer that is often discussed even in clinical circles, that people with antisocial don't want relationships or don't have emotions. They absolutely do have emotions. They can have subdued emotions or limited emotions, but they still have emotions. They also have attachment needs, just like every other human. They might be convoluted and difficult for them to navigate, and they might have a lot of associations with relationships that make it hard for them to pursue or trust relationships, because when they were teenagers, they might have run into a lot of consequences to themselves, people breaking up with them, people not wanting to be with them, people bullying them, people being very upset at them. And you might, as a developing young person, decide, well, I'm different, and so I guess I don't like relationships, and I'm just going to say that to myself to cope, that kind of stuff. So I can imagine someone like that running into some emotional problems, having some questions about their personality, and ending up in therapy. In fact, I know that. I've had clients like that occasionally.
Right on.
Okay, going on. Fast forward a few years, and I am now a doctoral candidate in a clinical psychology program.
Wow.
I can see how it may be difficult to understand why someone like me would desire to work in the field, especially given my deficits in empathy and remorse. But I am not just my diagnosis. What do you think about this so far, Bob?
This is really interesting. I want to learn more.
Yeah. Well, What's your initial reaction?
I want to ask questions like, what led you into the field, and what is it like to sit in therapy with somebody? What would a session feel like, and how would I'd like to watch one. That'd be really cool, actually. Mm-hmm. And I'd like to learn about how, since empathy is so essential to good therapy, how they navigate. So fascinating. Mm-hmm. I could imagine them being really good at it.
How so?
Well, one of my deficits as a therapist is I worry too much about what people think of me, and so that can at times hamstring me, and lead to but if I'm not worried about what people think, and I'm just imagining what they need or what would be best, then I might be just very matter of fact and straightforward about what's happening in them, and just reflect that back to them without really much compunction or worry at all.
Mm-hmm.
That'd be cool.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
I hadn't thought of that, but I've heard that before, and that absolutely is a benefit. In fact, I've often said that to be a good therapist, you have to be slightly antisocial, because you have to be willing to break from social convention to ask the tough questions and to confront social givens that are problematic.
Right.
And the less antisocial you are, the harder it is for people to do that.
Yeah.
A little bit of antisocial actually can help people. The classic example that I give is that if you come to a stop sign or a stoplight in the middle of a flat plain, in the middle of like Kansas or something, and it's broad daylight and there isn't a car in sight, do you just sit there at the light for however long? Or is it okay, if you feel like it, to blow through the red light? And what would your answer be to that?
Well, this happened to me for months. When I would drive down to the beach house, there was some construction going on a 2-lane road, and so one of the lanes was blocked off, and they had a temporary stoplight there for traffic, and I always just waited for it to turn green.
Even though there wasn't a single reason,
Yep.
a single safety reason.
Yep.
Yeah. I will blow through those things if I am 100% sure that there's no risk of harm.
Right.
Because it's illogical and annoying to me. But
You want to get where you're going.
I'm more antisocial in that way. I'm more willing to put myself before societal norms. Mm-hmm. Starting a podcast was a big part of that, actually, because especially back then, my goodness, for years I would hear, for years after I started the podcast, I would hear many people in my field talk about how it was unethical as a therapist to be on social media at all.
Oh, that's just a little rigid.
Well, especially now, what we would say.
Yeah, yeah.
But when Facebook first came around, I don't know if you remember this, but for the first number of years, it was a hotly debated topic of, can a therapist have a Facebook page?
The only reason I have one is because you made it.
Yeah, yeah. And I think you have the same profile picture. And yeah, people were saying that up until I heard therapists saying that just like 6 years ago.
Wow.
In a class for online ethics for therapists.
Huh. Well,
and a student said that, and the facilitator, the teacher, didn't push back on it. I think because he just didn't want to cause a problem, but it was out there. Anyway, so it was a very risky thing for me, but I said, this is like a stoplight in the middle of nowhere that does nothing. I understand, if we go by the Kohlberg thing, I understand the bigger picture of the meaning of these ethical codes, that they're set up to reduce harm to clients and to the public and to students and supervisees as well. And so if I feel very confident in my ability to move forward with this and to keep an eye on that, then I know that I'm doing the right thing, even though in fact, I wish I had given a survey back then, but I'm guessing that if I had asked 100 therapists if it was unethical for me to have the podcast, I'm guessing 95% would say, at the very least, it was somewhat unethical, just on its face, regardless of what I was talking about. Now, things have rapidly changed since then, but
right.
You'll still find therapists today that will, they'll have these blanket statements like, any therapist on TikTok is unethical, or any influencer therapist is unethical. I'll see that on different forums. To me, I'm like, it fucking depends.
Yeah.
It you can have a therapist who is doing a lot of good for society and even their clients by being on TikTok, and you can have a therapist that is harming the profession and their own clients. Anyway, so having a little bit antisocial might actually help. But so you're saying that if you have full-blown antisocial, it might actually be a benefit because you'd be able to not have to worry about the backlash from a client, even though this is going to help them ultimately. You know what I mean?
Your heart rate might not change much during a session. Like if you were doing couple therapy and it got heated, your heart rate might not change much. And so you have access to your good thinker and perhaps can, as a result of that, intervene more effectively than somebody whose heart rate is up.
But it is a question about that you brought up of, if you don't have empathy, how are you a therapist?
How do you get in someone's shoes? It's probably not impossible, but maybe it requires a kind of effort that maybe comes easier for somebody else.
I think another question is, if you lack empathy or you have very limited empathy, why do you want to be a therapist?
Don't you want to learn? I want to learn.
Yeah.
Like what drove them in? What brought them into the field? Yeah.
Well, they don't really get into it, but maybe they can write in. But I think it's a worthy question, and it is clear from this case that you don't need that. And I think that's a an understanding that should be scrutinized a bit, right? That to be a therapist, you must at least have the normal level, if not an inordinate level of empathy and care and compassion for other people.
Mm-hmm.
Also, might this individual, anonymous middle tier patron, have compassion regardless of not having empathy? You know, there's a lot of debate and a lot of research and really philosophy around these words of compassion and altruism and empathy,
right,
sympathy. It's complicated. We tend to lump a lot of things, especially today, into the word empathy.
Yeah, right.
Because originally empathy just meant that you are feeling someone else's feelings, whether or not you cared to or not. You're on the bus and someone's having a freak out and you feel that freak out. You're starting to feel anxious.
Right.
And that's empathy.
Right.
And now empathy is used for that, but it's also used for care and sympathy and compassion and wanting to help somebody else, you know, caring about someone else's feelings.
Right.
And I feel like we should be saying those other phrases more often than just the word empathy. Anyway, before we move on, let's take a break. What do you say, Bob?
Yep. Take a break.
Okay, we're back from the break. So going on with the email. Being in my program has really shown me just how many misconceptions there are in the field regarding people who are similar to myself with antisocial. I am so frequently subjected to people talking about how treating antisocial personality disorder is not only a pointless endeavor, but also the notion that treating a psychopath is just an exercise in creating a better psychopath. Bob, have you heard of this?
No, I never heard of that last bit.
Oh, I have. Absolutely.
Really?
Yeah. It's probably the dominant thing that I've heard. I agree with Anonymous Middle Tier Patron. It's upsetting that it's still happening, but people will say that you cannot treat a psychopath or someone with antisocial. There's no benefit, and that it will, in the end, actually harm, because what you're doing is you're teaching the psychopath how to game yet another system.
Huh.
Because they're always on the take. They're always manipulating. Okay. They're never actually giving you meaningful work in therapy. They're either avoiding or they're playing you. And at baseline, it's just going to be worthless. But it might even result in you being played such that you actually advocate for the client, for the client in a way that would release them from prison or something.
Right.
Or the client learns, okay, I've learned how to manipulate that therapist. I've learned a new skill of manipulation, so now I can continue to manipulate others. I've heard this my entire career. You've never heard that before?
I've heard that last bit, but what was the thing that they wrote?
They said that they've heard that treating antisocial is not only pointless, but that treating a psychopath is just an exercise in creating a better psychopath.
Yeah, that I've never heard. But I get it, but I just haven't ever been exposed to that idea.
And Bob, have you heard anyone ever say that it can be a fruitful endeavor to treat someone with antisocial?
No, I never have.
Yeah.
And that's kind of, to think about it, it's sad that that's the case.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because that isn't what the research shows.
Right.
By the way. And I'll get more into it at the end of this email, but going on. I'm not going to act like I do not understand why there is this apprehension in the field around treating antisocial, but I cannot help but look down on my peers and my professors for discussing this population as if we were subhuman.
Wow.
Especially when there has been so much research in recent years that clarifies many misconceptions about psychopathy and offers potential treatment options. I have found that you are one of the few people who discusses antisocial and psychopathic people in an empathic manner. I would love for you to make a deep dive on psychopathy and antisocial someday, as I'm sure that you will. But in the interim, I would appreciate it if you and Bob could speak to the lack of understanding about antisocial in the field. Any other thoughts, Bob, before I go into my notes here?
Well, I feel sad, and I really appreciate this email.
Yeah. Patron, this is not good. It annoys me too, not only for this particular situation, but also for clients with antisocial. Also, the way that the society and people in our field will talk about people with psychopathy and people with antisocial on the internet, it's this very blanket statement that I think is basically just another word for evil that they will use. Narcissistic has replaced that more recently, but there's this very firm notion in our culture that you have good people and you have evil people. And these evil people are subhuman. They're animals. They are fundamentally different. They are functionally different in their brains. And I've bumped up against this many times. You might have heard me bump up against it when I'm talking with Umberto, particularly in the past. It took me years to kind of break him of this idea. And it might be true. And there is some evidence that when we measure them through functional MRIs, there can be differences on average.
Oh, in their neurology?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But even that word is a little funny because only what we're saying is that the fMRI is picking up on oxygen being delivered to this brain in a slightly different way than the oxygen being delivered to this other brain.
Right.
And these studies, they often have an N of like 12. And for someone to claim that they've found a significant difference between the antisocial group and the non-antisocial group, they could have 6 of each, and 3 on the antisocial side had this difference, and only 1 in the non-antisocial had this difference. So you have many people in the antisocial group who didn't show that difference in oxygen in the brain, and you even had some people in the non-antisocial group who showed the same pattern in the brain. So what are we really saying, right?
That's not statistically significant.
Right. So what are we talking about when we talk about these quote-unquote different brains, right? And it's just way more complicated than that. In the future, might we find there's an answer to the question as to what is different about the brain and development, maybe even pre-birth, that leads to developing an antisocial? Yeah, but we are not there yet.
That could be really interesting.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure in the future they'll have all sorts of answers to those questions, but we're far from that. But anyway, yeah, it's just another word for evil.
Well, do you think that maybe one of the things is for the antisocial folks that they process information outside of some of the emotion centers of the brain, or less so? Like maybe I'm just thinking about this because I'm learning a little bit about neuroscience, and I'm just wondering if maybe.
I don't know the answer to that question, but there are models that I've found to be useful at times to adopt, one of which is that people with antisocial do not have as robust of a fear center as other people do. And so when they are young, they will see these kids act in very dangerous ways to themselves. Like they'll jump off things that are scary to other kids. And also the model goes is that for kids with the normal level of fear response, when you have an authority like a parent who is upset at you and says, hey, don't do that. Don't throw that rock at your brother, or don't steal that candy from the store, that the child will have a fear response, and that will encode this association with doing quote unquote bad things, with danger. And that's how we develop morality.
That's interesting.
Right, because we don't normally think of morality as being a fear-based process, right? We think of it as an empathetic process, but it's possible that it's largely a fear-based process, which isn't a bad thing. I mean, when you word it that way, it sounds abusive to children, but it might actually be the natural way. And it kind of makes sense because the way that our emotions evolved, seemingly, it's impossible for us to know, but like a parallel emotion would be the fear of separation from our tribe, from our caregivers. We're 2 years old and we're on the African savannah 200,000 years ago, and our parents walk away to do something and we're left there alone. Children will have a massive fear response as if they are about to be eaten by a tiger or they're falling off a cliff. It's the same emotional response that was around in our pre-social species, and it wasn't that fear would not happen if the parents moved away in these species that didn't depend on social proximity for survival. And so as our species evolved into the sort of species that required children stay close to their parents, it just co-opted that fear of falling off a cliff or of a tiger eating your head. Those kinds of fears were just co-opted to motivate that child to scream or follow their parents. In the same way, in terms of morality, which is a social thing as well, that our species could have co-opted that fear of falling off a cliff to motivate the child to learn how to live in harmony with a community.
Right.
And without that sort of fear, then it will throw a wrench in that development, that normal developmental process that happens for kids in a natural way when they're growing up. And so by the time they're 5 or 55, they just don't have that association of fear and cringing. That's that cringing feeling, right, that we feel of watching a social bad that's happening, like Curb Your Enthusiasm, this kind of thing. You're watching Homer Simpson like say something that's off color, and then we feel that fear because we're identifying with the character, and we're worried that there's going to be some kind of social ostracization and rejection. And why do we feel that fear? Well, we might not have been born with it. It might have been taught to us by people actually reacting to us in a way that caused us fear when we were very young. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, yeah, patron, I'm sorry that you're going through that, and I totally understand your disappointment. I mean, even if you didn't have Antisocial, it would be disappointing, but particularly since you don't have Antisocial. And what I'm guessing is that you don't raise your hand and say, by the way, I have Antisocial. I don't appreciate the way you're talking about me. And frankly, I don't even think you're safe to do that.
Yeah.
Which is when I say that out loud, it's like, my God, that you could have someone with Antisocial who's in the program, and everyone, including the professors, are talking about people with Antisocials being subhuman and not following the science and just saying that it's useless to treat these people and that they're basically always monsters and they're always going to be a monster. To think that this person can't raise their hand and say, that's not the science and that's not my experience and I have Antisocial, is a strong, horrific indictment on our field.
Yeah.
So, I get it. I usually run into this when it comes to narcissistic or borderline or something, but with Antisocial as well.
Makes sense that it would.
Now, I want to be clear that this is one of the factors for this problem in our field, is that there have been many documented cases of psychopaths and people with Antisocial who were not salvageable and did play their therapists and did manipulate their therapists into believing something. Like a classic example is you have a chronic psychopath who is incarcerated and being evaluated for parole or for shortening a sentence or something.
Right.
And bleeding heart therapist comes in, psychologist to evaluate, and gets seduced, not in the sexual way, but in the social way. And the psychologist becomes not only believing that this client or this prisoner has been reformed, but becomes an ardent advocate for this person and starts really making it their mission in life to free this man. And then they manage to convince everyone around them, and then the man is freed, and then he kills somebody.
Right.
Like the next day. There are many cases like this. And so what happened was that you had those cases, and then instead of saying, well, we should have consultation, we should have more education, we should have countertransference management, we should have other kinds of questions. Also, is it a viable question that a psychologist would be able to predict someone's behavior in the future? I mean, we do our best, but we can't know. We're not magical creatures. No one is. So instead of that, it's like, well, let's just all agree that psychopaths are unsalvageable and they're always playing you.
Right.
That's what happened. Also, personality disorders in general are difficult to understand, and for clinicians, research shows that. Also, it's just plain easier to write people off. I see this all the time. People with antisocial, with borderline, with narcissistic. It's just easier to say, look, I'm just going to categorize them as the baddies, and I don't want to have to get into it with them. I don't want to have to worry about getting exposed to them. I don't want to have to learn new concepts or deal with my own inner narcissistic person. It's just easier to just to say, they're all worthless or they're unsalvageable. So moving on in life. This happens all the time, even when someone isn't labeled as having a personality disorder. I've had many supervisees who will run into a client early in their career who has a personality disorder that challenges therapy greatly, but the therapist hasn't recognized the person as a personality disorder, and the supervisee will come to me and say that they are getting advice from other people that they should fire their client because they're not meaningfully participating in therapy. And I will, hear their assessment of the client and conclude that the client likely has a personality disorder of some sort, and that people come to therapy because they have problems. So if you want to be a real therapist, you're not going to reject them because they have a problem. Right. And this is a well-documented problem for over 100 years in our field. It's not a mystery. It's not an obscure thing. And so if you signed up to be a therapist, now's your time to shine. And 99% of the supervisees are totally on board with that because they want to be They want to be a real therapist. Also, it's just frankly scary, which is totally rational, to work with someone who lacks empathy, because there are questions. If they don't care about my feelings, then are they going to hurt me? Is that going to happen? Are they going to hurt someone that I care about? It's a legit question. It's not hard to overcome that and work with it. But I think that fear can cause people to run and justify their running.
Yeah.
Also, there's just too much misinformation. Fictional villains, and now with online chatter, there's so much information out there that says that once a psychopath, always a psychopath, and if someone's antisocial, then they're a true monster. There's no point. In today's world, I would guess that 99% of the potential influences on a therapist come from the internet. And because, young people and people in general, they're on the internet like 5 hours a day. And for the rest of their life. And pre-graduate school, they're on the internet. So what's the chance that the few hours that you spend in graduate school and the very few hours that are even spent on antisocial? I mean, how many hours in our master's degree would you estimate was spent on antisocial?
20 minutes maybe?
Yeah. If that. Because we had probably, we've talked about this before, we had 10 weeks of psychopathology.
Right.
And it's covering the entire DSM, which is like 1,000 pages.
That's a big book.
One out of 70 chapters, 60 chapters is the personality disorder chapter, and 1 out of the 9 personality disorders is antisocial. So do the math on that.
Yeah. Not
a lot of time spent on it.
No.
So
plus the DSM, I mean, as a resource, it is indeed very limited.
Right.
Yeah.
So when you match that up with all the content on the internet about antisocial.
Sure.
Anyway.
And all the sort of pop culture tropes.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But first, Bob, before moving forward, let's take a break. What do you say?
Yeah, let's take a break.
All right, we're back from the break. Let's go on here. And the last factor is that leaders in our field don't have an incentive to stick their neck out for people with antisocial. It's similar to how for 17-year-olds to vote, to get the right to vote, because there's been a movement to lower the age because society does affect younger people. Mm-hmm. I don't know how I feel about it. I'm not taking a stance on it one way or the other. In order for 17-year-olds to get the right to vote, you have to have adults that will vote for 17-year-olds, because 17-year-olds don't have the right to vote. And once 17-year-olds become 18-year-olds, then there's not a huge motivation to advocate for people a year younger than you. So you're always going to be in a state of powerlessness because no one cares enough or wants to put their reputation on the line for you, because there's not a huge benefit and there could be huge consequences, right? So for people with antisocial, I have the freedom to do it because I'm self-employed. But if I worked at a university or if I was part of an agency or something, there could be a backlash and I could get fired, or I could have a boss that could tell me to shut up, or I would have to deal with having to insult all my colleagues and say that they're all idiots.
Social ostracism.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And for what? That people with antisocial get treated better? Like, what do I get out of that, right? Plus, there are people with antisocial that don't deserve to be treated better. I mean, because it's a thing. There are people with antisocial who do deserve to be treated better, absolutely. But there's not a lot of benefit and there's a lot of risk. And so similar to how you don't have a lot of clinicians sticking their neck out for non-offending pedophiles.
Right.
What's the benefit? What's the upside? And there's a ton of downside. So it's just easier to just not, even if you think the way that we do. There's no hashtag movement. There's no marching in the street. There's no ribbon that you wear that says, hey, we need to treat non-offending pedophiles, or we need to treat non-harmful antisocial people. There's not a benefit.
The nail that sticks up is the one that gets the hammer.
Unless you are at one of the stages of Kohlberg's theory of morality development.
You got to be at 6.
In which you are operating from a universal set of ethical principles, and you're operating on, that morality is based on abstract reasoning and a commitment to justice. That's when you will speak up and say something.
Boy, man, you move everybody to stage 6, they will do 2 things. They will go slower because they're going to be burning a lot of oxygen and glucose in their brains, and they will make better decisions.
What do you mean?
Well, most of the time we're on autopilot. 90% of the day, we're just doing shit that's rote because it's in procedural memory. And in order to actually make decisions based on ethical principles, you have to use the different parts of the brain, and they burn a lot of oxygen and glucose. And our biology is based on economy, man. Save energy wherever possible. So we are very good procedural memory, get through the dayers. We're great at that. Mm-hmm. But to actually think outside the box, if it's kind of a trite way to put it, but to actually think about the things which is one of the things I love about being a therapist, is I have to. I'm forced to use a different part of my brain and expand it.
Yeah.
And that is terrifying at times and mostly awesome. So, but you could say that a lot of training is getting good clinical behavior into procedural memory, which actually is somewhat true. So if I fuck up with a client like I did the other day and they call me on it, I'm very quick to say I'm sorry, because I've done it enough times that I know exactly how this goes, and I don't have to think about it. It doesn't cost me anything. And it actually, they were right. I did fuck up, and they were kind enough to offer a correction, and I took them up on it, and also apologized for, what in retrospect is a bit of inanity on my part. But when I first had to do that, that was humiliating.
Yeah.
And there was a pretty steep curve to learn. I'm grateful, but it's painful. It's like all learning.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Painful, path of least resistance in our brain. And this is possibly the next deep dive I'm going to do. So more on this later. But for now, just to explain more, because I've basically been saying everyone's an idiot without saying how they're an idiot. And so let me let me tell you what the science is and
You're
what
dismissing the dismissers. Is that what you're doing?
Yeah, it's easy to do that. It's harder to justify it. So let me justify it, which is that absolutely you can have psychopaths and people with antisocial that are potentially irredeemable. They've gone too far, or they just make their own choices such that there's no reforming them, and they probably need to be locked up for the rest of their life. I've been close to some of these folks. It's heartbreaking, but when you witness the terrible amount of pain and abuse and harm that they cause around them, I certainly didn't feel bad about them being locked up for the rest of their life. Having said that, there's a lot of factors that go into behavior, with personality and specifically antisocial personality being just one of those factors. And in terms of the construct, we have to tease out exactly what we mean when we say antisocial, because there are other constructs that are not included in the DSM for weird reasons, but used to be, such as sadism. So sadism is a known personality trait that has a ton of research around it, that is separate but overlapping, often being comorbid with someone with antisocial. It's associated, but it's not always the case. So you can have someone who is sadistic, meaning that they wake up in the morning and they seek to gain pleasure by harming others or witnessing harm of others. And for some of these folks, they will also be antisocial in that they don't care about other people's feelings. They just don't have that feeling that the rest of us get when we harm other people. Mm-hmm. And thus, they will wake up in the morning, have a motivation to harm others, and they will act on it because they don't care. But you can have someone who's antisocial who doesn't have sadism, who doesn't wake up in the morning and say, I can't wait to hurt other people. But if they happen to hurt someone else, they don't register that pain or that empathy the same way that other people would. But that doesn't mean that they still move forward with it, because they might have an intellectual understanding or a slight bit of empathy that they have to highlight and oomph up a little bit to motivate their behavior. It's sort of like with someone with ADHD. They might naturally, if they just behave without meds or without any kind of measures in place, they might go through the day and leave their keys at work or forget to pick up their laptop from the bus station, or they might, in the middle of a conversation, just say squirrel and walk off. But if they put their mind to it and they have enough energy and they have these coping skills, they can double check that they might have a little reminder as they're walking out the door that says laptop, keys, whatever. And they do that, and that accommodates their issue such that they don't have consequences. Well, people with antisocial can do the same thing. They can highlight, like, okay, if I just act normally, I'm going to risk harming other people. I don't want to do that. So how can I account for this? And I've worked with clients in this situation, and what they will do is they will learn through experience that they have to ask themselves a question consciously: am I about to hurt someone's feelings? Is there a risk here? Now, for non-antisocial people, typically this is a subconscious feeling that we get with empathy and with experience. We don't have to ask ourselves those questions. We sometimes do, but in daily interactions, we don't have to as much. But for them, they do, especially if, because they often do, want intimate attachment relationships with people, because they get the same fulfillment that other people do. They might have a flattened affect about it, but they have affect and they have emotions. And so they will have to pay attention to how their behavior might impact their partner more so than other people do. I mean, everyone needs to do this, but people with antisocial just have to pay particular attention, and they have to maybe learn. They have to be overt. And I've worked with people like this too. They might have to ask their partner, so by the way, I have this thing called antisocial. I don't want to hurt you. I actually love you in my way, and I want to have a relationship with you that doesn't harm you. but I can't really rely on my own guidance system. So can you work with me on this? Like if I hurt your feelings, can you not assume that I'm a dick and inform me in a way that gives me the opportunity to learn? Because I don't want to do that again. It gets weird because even in that process, the person with antisocial can get kind of self-righteous. You can kind of even hear it in this email. He's talking about how in the same breath of him saying, which is true, that he's being treated as subhuman. In fact, I think I even deleted a sentence from his email where it was more aggressive. the way that he was thinking about the people in his school is more narcissistic, which comes along with the territory.
Yeah.
And it gets weird. It's not all fun and games, and there are a lot of personality issues you have to navigate. I'm making it seem easy, but it isn't easy.
Mm-hmm.
So you have antisocial, meaning lack of empathy generally. That's what we are referring to when we're talking about antisocial or psychopathy. We have sadism. We have narcissism, which is another construct, narcissistic personality disorder, but also just general narcissistic personality. And then we have Machiavellianism. This is the dark tetrad. So all of those things are separate things. If you have all four of those things, my goodness, that's someone to avoid. And
dangerous folk.
Yeah, unless they're really working on it. But if you wake up in the morning and want to harm others, and you don't care about other people's feelings, and you're very, very, very self-centered, and you plan in advance the harming of others to get your rocks off, so to speak, then this is a very dangerous individual. But if you just have antisocial and you're aware of things and you're working on it and you're a clinician, for crying out loud, then the risk is a lot lower. We understand this.
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean that you are narcissistic if you're antisocial, and it doesn't mean that you have sadism if you're antisocial. They're correlated. They often do come together, but they don't always. In the same way that you can have someone with sadism that isn't any of the other three. So for these individuals, they know that they love to see other people be harmed, but they care about other people's feelings. So they, if they don't engage in self-justification, they will figure out a balance in which they will be able to satisfy this need enough. It's sort of like with vampires in a lot of these movies where they'll eat animals, they'll suck the blood of animals instead of other humans.
It's not as satisfying, but I can get by.
It's a sublimation,
Yeah.
but it's necessary because they have empathy. Well, for someone with sadism, they want deep down to suck the blood of another human, but they'll sublimate, not with animals, but with like maybe cartoons.
Speaking
or
metaphorically here.
or fiction. Yeah. They'll watch videos of people being harmed that they aren't, like there are a lot of videos now coming out of war. People, soldiers are walking around with
their phones,
with GoPros and camp, body cameras, and publishing them on the internet. And there's a lot of footage in Ukraine and in Gaza right now, but all over the world, really. And if you want to, you can find these clips online on YouTube and Reddit and other places. And you're not participating in the harm of other people, hopefully. It's something that's happening whether you watch the video or not, frankly. And you watch the video and you get this pleasure, but you're not to blame. It's not your fault.
You haven't caused harm.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, I'm sure, some people are thinking, well, if you're watching the video, that encourages the person to make the video, which encourages the action, and yeah, okay, we can ask those questions. But, I hope you get what I'm saying. At the very least, if you were to watch a fictional depiction, like a Star Wars movie in which someone gets thrown down a well or something, and you get that kind of charge, then, or you really love the villains in a movie, then, or you like Hannibal Lecter, that's a fictional, that kind of stuff. So, this is well understood, but it's complicated, and in our society, we don't talk about this kind of thing. And if you're a clinician that doesn't seek this information out, then you're just going to believe what society believes, and you're going to lump all those things into one thing. You're going to have this very stereotypical vision of someone with antisocial. And then in class, as a professor, you're going to say that they're irredeemable, and you actually are just causing more harm by reaching out to these people.
Yeah.
Pretty bothersome.
Yes.
And by the way, that attitude fucking perpetuates the problem, because if you have antisocial and no one tries to help you, then guess what? More problems.
Isn't it funny? There's a failure in empathy towards antisocial people. It's sort of ironic.
Wow. Yeah. Hurt people, hurt people, hurt people. Mm-hmm. Well, that does it for that episode of Psychology in Seattle. Everyone out there, please take care of yourself, because
you deserve it.